everyone, and welcome to episode 33 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danielle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. I think it's fair to say that as history lovers, we're always on the lookout for good books about the Middle Ages, which is why this week I'm speaking with one of the people who's been at the forefront of medieval scholarly publishing for, although he might not thank me for the phrase, half a century. This month, Boydell and Brewer is celebrating 50 years as a scholarly publisher, which is no mean feat when your specialty is the medieval period. To find out more, I spoke with one of the founders of Boydell and Brewer, Richard Barber. Richard is the author of many books, which unsurprisingly you can find in Boydell and Brewer's catalog, including The Reign of Chivalry, Legends of Arthur, and The Life and Campaigns of the Black Prince. We talked about how the field has changed over the last 50 years, what the trends are in medieval publishing these days, and what his best tips are for up-and-coming authors. Well, thank you, Richard, for joining me to talk about Boydell and Brewer. It's 50 years this year, isn't it?
That's right. We started in September, this month, 50 years ago, with £100 and 5 of us, 5 directors and no employees. And, well, we're now where we are. It's an independent, employee-owned business, and I think has a certain reputation in its field. In its field, I say in its fields, because we publish a lot of things beside medieval history.
Yeah, you started off with a mandate to publish medieval history, didn't you? Like this medieval studies was where you were going with it at first, wasn't it?
Well, actually, there was about 5 years when we didn't know where we were going. It was only a meeting with Richard Brewer, who was Professor of English at Cambridge, that really started us down the medieval track. I'm a medievalist, but I'd never really thought of actually, doing medieval publishing myself until Derek came and said he was fed up with the university presses and would I kindly start a publishing firm for him, because we'd met before doing academic publishing. And so we started up DS Brewer Limited, and we were then called Boydell Press. But after 2 or 3 years of spending all our time doing cross charges to each other, we decided it was easier to be Boydell and Brewer. So that's where it came from.
So when Derek Brewer mentioned this to you, was this the first you'd ever thought about creating a press?
No, we'd got the press going, but we were thinking of doing quite different things with it, such as getting a big bank to back a book on opera, say, or something like this. It was going to be what we call over here sponsored publishing. Mm-hmm. But it was just after one of the recessions, and there wasn't any money for it. So we did a string of odd things to keep it going. And we did a lot of local books because we bought a little local printer's stock of books. And then it just worked out gradually from there. And we never had a great sort of moment when we got it started or got bigger. It just grew.
Like it or not, it just grew. So what was the first book that you published?
The first ever book was... it was by a Scottish author, and it was about the Sudden House and Sir Walter Scott, and it was entirely a sort of private family history kind of thing. And then we went on to do 1 or 2 other books like that on Robert Burns, 1 or 2 novels. We published a first novelist aged 75, who went down like a storm. He was Yorkshire, and all the Yorkshiremen loved him. So we've done quite a lot of things in that time. And then we just picked up odd things like the list from the local Suffolk publisher, with a beautiful book, actually, which is still in print on Suffolk churches, which is a classic study of the wonderful churches we have in Suffolk. And then the medieval list started to grow because we reprinted a couple of my own early books with a firm in the States and built it up from there, because they used to take 100 copies or so of anything we did. And eventually we realized that we really had to get into the States.
Yeah.
So we did. And we got somebody to run an office out in Rochester, and that then developed into the University of Rochester Press, which we actually started with the help of the provost.
Yeah, like you say, it's really grown.
It's just a sort of one one damn thing after another, if you like.
Yeah, because I've noticed that if you look back to the list, and if you look at the About Us page on Boydell and Brewer's site, it talks about how you've expanded. Like, you're talking about starting off with Scottish history, and then you've got German history, and then you've got African history, and music history, and these are all kind of big lists that you're dealing with right now.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the other really big list is music, because we're very close to the Aldeburgh Festival, which was founded by Benjamin Britten, and we've published with them now for 25 years. And because of that, we've picked up a lot of contacts in the music world, and we're actually one of the biggest publishers of academic music anywhere, which is rather surprising. I love music, but that I'm not a complete amateur.
As a medievalist, sometimes you find yourself in very strange places, including publishing music.
Yeah. And then people have come to us with fascinating things. I remember one of Derek's first books was called The Medieval Leper. And it was a doctor who wrote it, and he'd been interested in modern leprosy, which still exists, of course. In Europe, in fact, he found a place in Finland where they still had it. And so he got onto the medieval history, and we considered this book, rather. And I looked at the pictures, and I'm absolutely horrified. I said, Derek, we can't possibly publish this. Nobody will buy it. The pictures are so horrible. And we did publish it. And later I was browsing through the book, and one of the tests for leprosy was that you put the person in the middle of the church, and everybody looked at them. And if they couldn't bear to look at them, they got leprosy. If they could look at them, they got some other skin disease.
Wow, I've never heard of this ever.
Reaction to the photos. It does lead you into some strange things.
Wow, that's really interesting and horrible, but interesting.
Horrible, but interesting.
I think you could describe a lot of the Middle Ages like that.
Yes.
So, as a medievalist, and you've been kind of in the trenches of publishing for 50 years now, how do you think the field has changed over time?
Well, it's changed partly. I think one thing we notice is that the literary side is more complex. I mean, the problem is, and I'm a historian, so I can say this, that really only so many books you can write on Chaucer. You can't do many more, and I feel sometimes that it's the kind of monograph proposals, which are difficult anyway for people to do, tend to be not as strong. We had some wonderful monographs in the early days, and those don't seem to come out really from anywhere nowadays. Whereas history seems to be stronger in that respect. There's always something new. There's much more undiscovered material, if you like. Well, Chaucer, you're just approaching him again and again from the same angle. And I would say that you get more fashions in history now. And also, I mean, the other progress in both history and literature is the whole business, first of all, of feminist side of things, and then the gay, queer literature side of things, which I'm old-fashioned enough. I'm absolutely fine with them, but I just have a twinge occasionally.
It's a surprise to you sometimes that this is how people are approaching the Middle Ages? Is that what you mean?
I just wonder occasionally if they're looking for things that aren't there. This is rather naughty of me, but I genuinely think that there's a danger that the material isn't there because it wasn't recorded. They're missing from the record, and it's very hard to... It makes it harder to write that kind of history.
It's definitely hard to make definite conclusions about things that would have been hidden from view back in the day, like you're saying. So it just takes very careful scholarship, I think. But some of the people many of the people on your list are just great scholars and can find this sort of hidden material, which is fantastic.
It's a matter of luck as much as judgment sometimes, so.
That's true. With history, what exists, what can we work with? Do you find that that people are submitting a wider breadth of history books now to you? Like, are we looking at more of a global Middle Ages in the proposals that you're getting?
I would like to think we were, because I'm very keen on the sort of global side of things. And my own work recently has been right across Europe. And one of the worries actually is now the number of historians who don't actually have even a second language.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're in medieval history, you ought really to have, I hate to say it, Latin, French, and German, which is quite a tall order. I mean, I was lucky because I was a linguist before I was a historian. But I do notice that it is a problem with some people today.
Yeah, it is. And
And
I mean, people are not learning Latin in school anymore.
absolutely not. And it's jolly difficult actually to find good Latinists anyway to translate things. They tend to be retired and they don't go on forever.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, and medieval Latin is a special challenge. It's not classical Latin. It's kind of bastardized.
I'll tell you a secret. It's a damn sight easier than classical Latin. I could never do classical Latin. Medieval Latin is just French translated into Latin.
You know, I never thought of it that way, and maybe
And
that would have made a difference.
very interesting. The word order is the same as French, or, well, not English, but as French, by and large, whereas classical Latin has all these peculiar structures. There we are. I'm being naughty.
So you've heard it here first. If you're going to study Latin, study French and Latin. You know, when I was in high school, I took French and Latin at the same time, and the tests were very difficult because the words are so close. I wouldn't do that again. So where do you see the field going then? If we're looking sort of to expand the field a little bit more, where do you see it going?
Where we see a lot of development now are these very big projects. Over here, they're backed by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And you've actually got a better chance, it seems, of putting up a sort of £1 million project than you have of getting sort of £3,000 to help you with the publication of the next book, because they like the big projects. And one of our challenges now is to see the spin-offs from these projects. Because there'll obviously be a book come out of them. But what we need to be looking for is the other book that could come out of the same group of people.
Oh, okay.
So that's something that's changed.
Oh, that's interesting, because that's how people used to kind of look at novels, right? Pick up a novelist that will have another novel in them. And you're seeing that when you're looking at proposals from academics as well, like what other work they might be doing?
Well, really, if they've come from a big project, and they put a proposal to us which is derived from that project but isn't actually the central book which they've had to do elsewhere, then yes, that's very interesting often. Of course, a big challenge, and this is where we really don't know what's going on, is open access.
Right.
I really don't know how it's working in the States and in Canada. Do you get open access much?
I think that the rules are a bit different. I can't really speak for it too much because I don't work directly in academia.
Yeah.
But I think that there are some very strict rules about what must be open access in the United Kingdom that are not the same. But I couldn't speak to that too much.
Yeah, I'm afraid we start from the view that anybody who was ever funded at all by public money should publish their work for free on open access. And it's a really big sort of question which nobody's got the answer to yet.
Yeah, I think that's right. Nobody's got the answer to this yet.
But we still do very well with what I call the semi-popular history, the popular history with a really strong academic background, but designed for a general reader. I think that's still one of our strongest suits. But there's quite a lot of competition for those books.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you were talking to someone that is kind of an up-and-comer, an early career person, would you suggest to them that they practice in writing in a trade sort of style as well as an academic style? Or do you think that there's kind of enough space for academic work?
I think the answer is they need to write the academic book first, because that's good discipline, and then they can change horses. I think it's that way around. If you start trying to write a popular book too soon, you'll get yourself in a muddle. In a way, it's a different skill, and it's one that, well, a lot of academics don't necessarily have. Mm-hmm. What they're researching and how they've researched it.
Yeah, and with Boydell and Brewer, you're looking for both ones that will appeal to a broader public as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is what we like because our academic background gives us a stronger reputation. We can look at a book and say it's not for us quite happily. We can develop ideas from academic books into popular ones sometimes. I've had a recent classic case, it hasn't actually come out yet, so I can't name any names, where somebody who had a very high reputation as a popular author came to us and said, effectively, he tried to write a PhD, do a PhD age 75, but couldn't get accepted anywhere. And he now wanted to write an academic book. And he'd spent far too long in the popular field, and they couldn't get him to write an academic book. But we've found a way around it. He's doing an edition or something instead, which is not so demanding of the academic style.
Yes, that's true.
So we have to be creative how we approach things.
That's interesting because so often we're talking about academics and telling academics that you also need to create a style that is popular. But I never looked at it from somebody who'd been writing trade forever and then having to write academic for a PhD. That might be me at 75. You never know. That's good. And like you say, I'm starting to notice that a lot of the books that are coming out of your press are academic in that the research is very tight, but they are readable for people who are not specialists. Yeah. And I think that it's hitting a really good spot in the market. A couple of the books that I recommended a couple of weeks ago were Urban Bodies by Carol Rawcliffe and The Medieval Clothier by John Lee, and those are just great ones.
Yes, in fact, that's part of a series, and that's the other thing we do like developing, which are series. And The Medieval Clothier is one of the medieval trades books, and there are, I think, about half a dozen of those now. In fact, we've really flourished on series, which is a side of the list that doesn't necessarily appear. We actually have journals, annual volumes, which cover Norman, the 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, and 15th century. I think one or two are biennials, but we do actually publish essays right across the medieval spectrum, and that sometimes leads to books. And it also gives us a very good sort of core. The libraries know that these are reputable journals and take them. And we also do a series of studies. We do Chaucer studies, and the one that I've been most involved in is Arthurian studies, which is on volume 84, which is quite a lot of books.
That is quite a lot of books. And like you say, it can be difficult to come at Arthur from a unique perspective.
Yes.
Because...
Well, I think the thing I'm probably proudest about having done is the classic edition of Malory by Peter Field, which is 2 really handsome volumes, and has actually, I think, was our best-selling book last year in terms of revenue.
Well, that's excellent.
It is expensive.
Well,
there we are.
But I mean, Arthur is still so popular. He's the once and future king, right?
Yes, yeah.
And you came to the field as an Arthurian, didn't you?
That's right, yes. I published my first book on Arthur 60 years ago next year.
Wow.
I've been stuck there ever since.
Well, it's an easy place to get stuck. That's how I came into it as well, was through that.
Right.
Yeah. And you worked on knighthood and chivalry throughout your career, right?
That's right, yes, yeah.
Especially in the 14th century.
14th and 15th century, because Edward III is the other thing I've rather specialised in. Well, certainly of recent years.
So is that the part of the list that you really devour when it comes in?
Yes, the trouble is I used to get a copy of every book we printed, but I didn't have room for them all because we published about 220 a year, and you can imagine what happens to the bookshelves. I try to spot the ones that I do need, but occasionally I find a book which I've never heard of, which turns out to be from Boydell.
That is an excellent problem to have, I think.
Yeah, it did.
But the people who are listening, they can't see you, but I can see that behind you is just an absolutely stocked library. It's amazing. Are most of these your books that you have behind you?
You're trying to read the titles, I know.
As any good medievalist would. Trying to read the titles. Yeah. Are most of these Boydell books that you have behind you?
Well, there are shelves of Boydell books because behind me is 100, the 80 volumes of Arthurian studies, and then sort of 20 volumes of Arthurian romances in translation, and then a lot of other things as well.
So
Yeah.
you are happy, if there is a storm outside, you're happy to stay inside because you've got all the Arthur you could ever want in there.
Yeah.
So you were mentioning earlier that you're seeing that history has fashions in it. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that quite a while, until the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a thing about you don't write books about famous people. I mean, famous people are not kosher. You've got to write about the ordinary people and do the kind of French, what they call the annal type history, which is all about you count the peasants on the farm and work out what they were up to.
Mm.
Uh, but I think there is very much room, and in fact, biography is still extremely popular. There is really room for a lot more biography. And from my point of view, I think that you do need to look at major figures in history because they do, I'm afraid, have a major influence, and you can't really deny it.
That's true.
And there's a kind of denial of that major figure approach to history.
I think that I'm wondering if that might have something to do with what you were saying about Chaucer. Like there are so many ways that you can approach one subject.
True. But and actually, it's you need a new biography of somebody every sort of 30 years or so, and that's for somebody where there's quite a lot of controversy. I mean, some good biographies last much longer than that. But there are a lot of people who I'd love to see biographies of, which don't exist in English and hardly in any language. I mean, one figure who I'm fascinated by is the Emperor Charles IV. And there is one German modern biography, nothing in French, Italian, English, and you hardly know of him. And yet he's an absolutely monumental figure and quite intriguing.
So that's your next project then?
Well, that brings me on to the book on magnificence because he's a central figure in that. And where he's interesting is that he was brought up at the French court. He was taught by a future pope. He wrote his own coronation service. He was very good on theology. He collected relics manically. He had about 600. And he was a very successful general. He built up the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, from a fairly low base into a major power, and did marvelous building works at Prague and elsewhere. And he was son, of course, of John of Bohemia, the blind king of Bohemia, who was killed at the Battle of Crecy. But he was then called Wenceslas, just to confuse you.
Of course, of course.
Of course.
Because it can be easy.
It could be easy. Yeah.
So when you're talking about coming out and doing new biographies of major figures, and that you think that there's more work to be done there, what are you envisioning? What is the more work that needs to be done on major figures? Do you think?
Well, simply that there has been a lot of, you've got to take in a huge amount of recent research for a start. But there are major figures who simply don't have a book on them, certainly in English. And I think that's definitely a field. The other thing I like, and I'm afraid this is why I come back to magnificence, is a theme which takes you right across Europe and across literature, music, art, throw everything in, so to speak. And I think books on large themes are definitely interesting.
So what kind of themes? What kind of themes are you thinking of?
I was thinking in this case of the Magnificence book, and that covers the whole of Europe over really 1300 to 1500 in detail, and looks at everything from people's accounts to the goldsmiths who worked for them, the musicians who played for them, the painters, and the buildings, and the whole kind of philosophy behind kingship. So there's a lot to take in there, and it's quite something to sort it all out.
Yeah, there is a lot there.
In a way, it draws hugely on the Boydell list because we do for instance, a lot of books on textiles and clothing. We did a wonderful book called Fashion in the Age of the Black Prince in 1970. It's still selling very well indeed.
Okay.
And the author began life as a couturier in Bond Street, went on to make a stage theatrical clothing for T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral,
Wow.
ended up lecturing on pictures in the National Gallery during the war, and got on to the question of dating pictures by the clothing. And she went onto the Courtauld and wrote this absolutely classic account using every kind of resource of what happened in that period. And it's riveting. Talk about fashion, it's worse than modern fashion in terms of what's in fashion this year and what they're wearing.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. And of course, the reenactors love this. And
Oh, yeah.
reenactors are definitely one of our big markets.
Really?
Oh, yes, yeah.
What kind of books are they going for?
Well, particularly about dress, but also arms and armour, tournaments, this kind of thing. What they really want is a sort of the how-to books. But we do quite a lot of translations of practical books from the Middle Ages.
Mm.
And translations actually are another thing we do really very comfortably because nobody could read Latin or French, they all want it in translation, and that's fine by us as long as we can find the translators.
Absolutely. Well, you're talking about your Fashion in the Age of the Black Prince book. Do you find that coming at these books through kind of an interdisciplinary approach is the best way to do it, where people are looking at art and literature and stuff within the same volume?
Well, if you're writing about fashion, you've got to draw on art quite a lot. You've got to draw on, what you really draw on a lot also are records, royal accounts, this kind of thing. And also on, the fairly thin pickings from archaeology of the period. But, they do dig interesting things up, like a piece of Chinese silk found in the Thames, dated to 1325.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating stuff. Is there a section that you think is really hot right now within the Boydell catalog, within the medieval section? So you're saying that reenactors are liking the very practical stuff. What is selling well for you right now?
I think I'm actually really not in touch enough with our sales department. But I'm trying to think. We were at Leeds, and what I think often the crossover between archaeology and history is a strong one. The other thing that's definitely up for us is a series on medievalism. Now that started with Tolkien and so on, and I didn't remember that we actually did anything about on Tolkien. Though one of our authors ended up advising on the Lord of the Rings film, but we weren't publishing in that field. But we now do. And medievalism in the great Game of Thrones is absolutely that's what's up.
Yes, medievalism is definitely a hot part of our field right now.
Absolutely, yes.
What makes a book a good book? If you're an academic and you're writing your first book, what is it that you should bear in mind if you're going to submit a proposal? What is it that makes an academic book successful?
I would put pretty high on the list the ability to write clearly and to write attractively. Most academics get there somehow, but I feel that they could get there faster if they really did think about how they're writing, the structure of the whole thing, and look at people who do it clearly. And I know that I was very fortunate. I was very well taught in terms of English, but even so, I've been learning an awful lot in the last year or two by really applying to, is this sentence saying what I want it to say? I think that would be my top tip for getting on, because, all right, if you're writing a highly academic book, it applies just the same. And if you feel you can only write it in academese, you're probably trying to hide something.
It's very possible. I hadn't thought of it, but it's very possible. You're right. You do want clarity, for sure. So clarity is something that you'd say is number one if you're submitting a book for publication.
Yes, that is the writing style to start with. And then, how clearly have you planned your book? You may have written it as a thesis. Now, that doesn't mean that what works as a thesis works as a book, and that is a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing to do, because rewriting something you've written once is much harder than writing it the first time.
Absolutely.
So I sympathize.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for coming on and talking to us about publishing and 50 years of publishing. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. No, that it's been great fun, and I hope I haven't told too many stories and not given you enough information.
No, you've been lovely. Richard's forthcoming book is called Magnificence, Princely Splendor in the Middle Ages, and it's out next year with, you guessed it, Boydell and Brewer. You can follow Boydell and Brewer on Twitter at Boydell Brewer. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hi, Daniel. Yeah, we've had a pretty busy week, and part of that is due to your new post on Richard the Lionheart and how he got his name. So that's on the site. You can also read George Theotokos talking about defending the Byzantine Empire, all the different ways they did that in the 10th century. And finally, we have directions on how to make medieval soap.
Sounds awesome. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Since we're talking about books, it seems like the right time to mention that my own book is coming out in the United Kingdom in less than 2 weeks. It's called Life in Medieval Europe, Fact and Fiction, and it's aimed at answering all those niggling questions you may have about life back then. It's available for pre-order all over the world, and while the UK gets it first, it'll be out in Australia in November, Canada in December, and the United States in January. Pre-ordering is actually really helpful for authors because it gives the numbers a boost in the opening week. So if that's an option for you, I would be super grateful. And speaking of writing, I'm back to writing regularly for medievalist.net as the 5-Minute Medievalist this fall. So for that and for more medieval goodness, you can follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at medievalists. You can follow me, Danielle Sobalski, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find Life in Medieval Europe, as well as my other books, on Amazon. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thank you, book lovers, for lending me your ears. Have yourself a wonderful day.